Hi, everyone. Welcome back to dinanddaf, where we conceptualize halakha based on a case study from that week's daf yomi. So this week's conversation is about a very fundamental question, which is how are we to understand when pesukim in the Torah that seem to mean one thing in the pshat, plain contextual meaning of the text, mean something completely different and maybe even conflicting in the way that Chazal interpret and apply them halachically. And a quintessential example of this comes up in the daf this week on Pei Gimel Amud Bet in Bava Kama to Pei Dalet Amud Aleph. The terminology in the Torah of ayin tachat ayin, taking an eye for an eye, and other such eye for an eye type punishments, is interpreted by Chazal not as if somebody knocks out someone else's eye, God forbid, then their eye needs to be knocked out as a punishment, but rather monetary compensation, mammon. That if somebody, God forbid, blinds someone else, their punishment should be a monetary compensation. Now, first of all, how did Chazal get to that? And second of all, on what authority are Chazal able to offer us an interpretation that is halachically applicable? This isn't just for sort of a nice Dvar Torah in shul. It's halachically applicable. So on what authority are Chazal able to give us such an interpretation, which seems to undermine the plain meaning of the text? And a lot of ink has been spilled on this question in general, the relationship between pshat and drash, between the plain contextual meaning of verses of pesukim and the rabbinic interpretation or expounding upon a verse. I would actually recommend two books if anybody's interested in this question, bigadol. And I'm going to share my screen to show you the cover of these books, because sometimes it's like, something clicks when you see it. The first book that I would recommend is a book that is called, it's written by Jay Harris, who is an academic, Professor Jay Harris, and the book is called How Do We Know This? Now, don't judge a book by its cover, because it looks very, I don't know, it kind of looks like it's about Hanukkah, which is interesting, even though it's only a 7-branched menorah, but you kind of look at it and you're like, wait, what's going on here? But How Do We Know This is actually a study of the way that different Jews, whether kind of authoritative or less authoritative throughout history, have understood midrash, meaning have understood the rabbinic interpretations of pesukim that don't necessarily comport to the meaning of the pasuk itself, the plain meaning of the pasuk, but moreover, the whole practice of rabbinic interpretation of a pasuk being authoritative. And it goes from, it really is a span of centuries, which is pretty remarkable. The second book that I'm going to suggest is something that is not academic, but something that is traditional. And that is the book that Rav Amnon Bazak wrote, which is, I think, an incredible compendium of approaches to this question. And I'm going to share my screen and show you. It is called Nitzchuni Banai, right? From the terminology at the end of the Tanur Shel Achnai story, where famously Rabbi Yoshua says, Lo bashamayim hi, the interpretation of Torah is not in the heavens, so we're not waiting for a bat kol, a heavenly echo, to tell us halakha is like so-and-so, but instead we have conventions for interpreting Torah, and we have conventions for figuring out what is the correct interpretation without asking God for help. This is a very explicitly post-Nevuah kind of approach. And at the end, the question is, what was God doing in heaven when this conversation went on? It says God was saying, Nitzchuni banai, my children have bested me. But another way of interpreting this, and I think it's the Maharsha, is for the word netzach, my children have made me eternal. Meaning, if we can figure out ways to interpret the Torah that don't rely on Nevuah, then we can continue to have Torah in our midst and continue to have it be relevant and understood and connected. It is a fabulous, fabulous book, and it's written in Hebrew, and you can find it in on Ivrit Ayin. It's an app that's an ayin with a little chirik underneath, It's basically like an online reading app of Hebrew books. It's pretty fantastic. But all that is to say, there is a lot more to this conversation than what I'm going to put out here today. What I'm going to put out here today are three approaches specifically to how it is and why it is that the interpretation of ayin tachat ayin is mammon, is money in Chazal, and why that is considered authoritative or how that is considered authoritative. You can apply these three approaches more broadly to other examples as well, but I wanted us to actually focus on the example in particular. It's incredibly rich. So the first approach that I will say is actually an approach that I think we find very much in the Gemara itself, right? The Gemara is trying to figure out ayin tachat ayin as mammon. Why? Because that's the only way that the pasuk makes sense, right? Now, the Ibn Ezra continues in this kind of logic. Remember, we're talking about Ibn Ezra being the 12th century, and I'm going to share my screen. What the Ibn Ezra does is he quotes Rav Sadia Gaon. Now, Rav Sadia Gaon, living centuries earlier than he did, is kind of the king of Pshat, right? Meaning he is the one who started kind of the Pshat movement. And arguably one of the reasons why he needed to start the Pshat movement of trying to understand Torah in its Pshat, and more than that, trying to argue that the way that Chazal understand Torah is the real Pshat of the Torah, is because the Karaites were arguing we should not understand Torah through the words of Chazal. We should just understand it on its own terms. And so Rav Sadia Gaon essentially said, well, actually, let me explain to you that the way we understand Torah through Chazal is the same as understanding the Torah on its own terms. It is the way the Torah makes the most sense, even in its contextual meaning. So let's take a look. So Ibn Ezra quotes Rav Sadia Gaon. Amar Rav Sadia says, Lo nuchal lefarish zeh pesukim mashmao. We can't interpret this pasuk of ayin tachat ayin in its literal meaning. Ki im adam hika ein chavero. Let's say somebody hit their friend in the eye, meaning their fellow in the eye. V'sarash lishit or einav. That person lost a third of their vision. Ech yitachen sheyukam maka kazot. Is it even possible to then afflict the culprit with that same exact wound, beli tosefet umigrat, without adding more blindness or less blindness, right? If you want it to be an exact measure for measure, there's no way. How are you going to punish someone so that they also lose exactly a third of their sight? Ulayachshich or eino kulo. Maybe they'll lose all their sight when you try to punish them by getting rid of a third of their sight. V'yoter kashe, and you know what's even harder to try to do measure for measure? Hakviyah, trying to do a burn for a burn. Va'apetza, va'chabura, different kinds of wounds. Ki'im hayu b'makom mesukan, because if these things were in a place that would endanger someone, if the wound was in a place that could be fatal, ulayamut, maybe the culprit will die. Ve'ein hadat sovelet. And you know what? The mind doesn't tolerate this kind of thing. In other words, what the Rav Sadia Gaon is saying is, don't you understand? Interpreting ayin tachat ayin or kviyah tachat kviyah or petzap tachat patza, etc., as the culprit has to pay money rather than the culprit is also going to get hit or wounded, is the only thing that makes any sense. How could you ever try to apply literal ayin tachat ayin? So Amarlo Ben Zuta, a well-known Karaite, responded to Rav Sadia, says, Valo katuv makom acher, but don't we have another pasuk, kasher yitain mum ba'adam, kein yinatain bo, that exactly the blemish that you put in a person that should also be given to the person who is, who was the culprit. Meaning, not just ayin tachat ayin, we have other places where it's very clear what you give is what you get. Va'agon heshivlo, and Rav Sadia Gaon responded to him, Yesh lanu bet tachat al. So he says, we have a bet that means al, meaning upon. So read it as, V'hinei ta'amo, here's the meaning. I'm going to read the beginning of the pasuk. Ka'asher yitain mumba adam, like a person gives a blemish to a person, kain yinatain alav onesh. Not you give the culprit the same wound, but you put upon the culprit the requirement to have some sort of punishment, namely money. Ben Zuta hishiv lo, and Ben Zuta says, well, what about the clause kasher asa kein yaselo? That which a person did should also be done to them. Va'agon hishiv, and the Gaon, Sfirfsadi Gaon says, well, let's look in other places in Tanakh. Hine Shimshon Amar, Shimshon said, kasher asuli kein aselahem, what they did to me, I will do to them, about the Plishtim. V'Shimshon lo lakach neshotehem, Shimshon didn't do exactly what they did to him. He didn't take their wives, and give them to other people. It means I give them what they're due, right? Meaning I punish them. It's a general terminology. It doesn't have to be literally what you did is done to you. Uvenzuta heshiv. So Venzuta says, okay, well, what if the person who gave the wound in the first place was poor? What's their punishment going to be? Meaning they can't pay. So how can it be? Va'agon heshiv, and Rav Sadigon says, well, I'll do you one better. Im iver ya'aver ein pikeach mayaselo. What if, under your understanding of the literal, an eye for an eye, what if the person who blinded this person was already blind themselves? Ki ha'ani yitachen she'asher v'yeshalem. At least somebody who's poor, if what actually has to be done here is a payment of money, at least somebody who's poor might be able to, at some point, have money and pay, right? But if it's literally an eye for an eye, a person who's already blind, who blinded someone else, can never pay back, can never be punished. And here's the rule, meaning here's what we're to understand from all of this. Lo nuchal lefaresh al derech mitzvot haTorah pirush shalem. We cannot understand a full explanation of the Torah im lo nismoch al divrei Chazal, if we do not depend on the words of Chazal. Ki kasher kibalnu haTorah min ha'avot, just as we got the written Torah from our ancestors, kein kibalnu Torah sheba'al peh, so too we got the oral Torah from our ancestors. Ein hefresh b'nehem, there is no difference between them. Okay, and by the way, if you're wondering, why does the Torah say it like that? If it really means mamon, here's the explanation of ayin tachat ayin. It means ra'ui lihiyot eno tachat eno, im lo yitain kofra. It would be fitting, it would be appropriate to take someone's eye if they blinded someone else, if they didn't give the kofar, if they didn't give the money, right? So what the Ibn Ezra is trying to do here in quoting Rav Saadia Gaon is essentially say, here's what we have to understand. Even when it looks like the interpretation of Chazal is undermining the plain meaning of the Torah, you're wrong. It's actually helping you understand the plain meaning of the Torah in a way that makes sense. Now, that is one approach, and very popular approach, to what we do when it seems that the relationship between Peshat and Derash is strained. So some people will argue, and this was actually a very popular 19th century and early 20th century approach. Some people will argue that what we're really doing is Chazal are helping us understand the true Pshat of what's going on. It looks like the Pshat is A, but when you really think about it, Chazal help you understand that the Pshat is really B. So that's one approach, right? That approach does not suggest that Chazal are doing anything truly innovative, to be honest, okay? That approach is suggesting that Chazal are basically just uncovering the authority of the pesukim themselves, and thankfully, we have Chazal to do that for us, okay? That's one approach. Now, the question of, just as the Torah she-bichtav was transmitted to us, to the Torah she-ba'al peh was transmitted to us, is the Ibn Ezra hinting to the idea that they're not figuring this out on their own, but it's actually something that was passed down. So it's the real pshat of the Torah, but it's the real pshat of the Torah that maybe gains its authority from something that's been passed down rather than them figuring out themselves. I think that's a fair question, and it actually points us to our second explanation. Our second explanation, and none of these explanations are totally clear-cut and sit on their own. They all have a little bit of sort of like a, wait, what about this? What about that? And I think that's important because it's a very hard question. It's a very foundational question. Our second approach, we are going to look at the Rambam for our second approach. It's really interesting that the Rambam looks at or offers up the example of ayin tachat ayin as mamon, as an example of halakha leMoshe miSinai, right? Now, halakha leMoshe miSinai is going to mean that a person, Chazal did not create it on their own. They did not understand it on their own. It doesn't really matter if that's the true pshat of the Torah. It is what we are supposed to do because it is given to God, from God to Moshe, and Moshe down to us. And take a look. This is in his introduction to his Perush HaMishnayot, as we call it, or Perush HaMishnah. This is an important principle that you should know. That explanations, interpretation of pesukim that have been accepted from the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, there is no machloket about them, right? So if you look in the Gemara and you find something where everyone seems to agree that pasuk Y means such and such, there's a great indication that this might be a halakha leMoshe miSinai, because a halakha leMoshe miSinai brooks no argument. Lefi sheme'olam lo matzanu machloket shenafla, ben hachachamim bizman min hazmanim. Because, for example, we've never found a machloket among any of the sages at any time, Moshe ad Rav Ashi, from Moshe Rabbeinu until what's considered the end of the Gemara of Rav Ashi, she'amar echad mehem, that one sage said, shemish sinei ayin, simei ayin, somebody who blinded somebody's eye, tisameino, or tismaino, that person's eye should be blinded. We don't see that opinion anywhere. Lema'amar Hashem ayin ba'ayin, in order to fulfill the idea that it's an eye for an eye. The Amar Acher, and somebody else says, no, shahadamim bilvad hu chayav, that a person only has to pay money. Meaning, the Rambam says we never find such a machloket. Why? Because ayin tachat ayin, meaning mamon, is a halakha leMoshe miSinai, right? So we don't even have to worry about whether it's pshat or whether it's not pshat in the contextual meaning, whether it makes sense to try to do ayin tachat ayin or it doesn't make sense to try to do ayin tachat ayin literally. What we need to know is that the authority comes from God. It's a halakha leMoshe miSinai, the same way the pasuk in the Torah comes from God, ayin tachat ayin. The interpretation of mamon comes from God, ayin tachat ayin, right? Now, what's interesting is I told you there's always a little bit of sort of like an asterisk. You got to wonder, is everything, are there footnotes here? The Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim, he actually talks about in the area of Moreh Nevuchim in the third book, where he's talking about reasons and explanations behind the mitzvot. He talks about the possibility of ayin tachat ayin being literal, and it's just interesting to see that. He says, "Misha chiser aver yichusar aver kamoto." Somebody who removed somebody else's limb should have their limb removed, meaning kasher yitain mum ba'adam kein yinaten bo, as Ben Zuta quoted to Rav Sadia Gaon, when a person puts a blemish in someone else, that same blemish should be given to them. But al tasik machshavatcha bazeh. Don't worry about it. Sha'anu onshim kan b'tashlumin, that we don't do that literally, but instead we say that it's money. Ki matrati achshav, right now my purpose in writing this is latei tam l'ktuvim. I'm trying to give reasoning to the pesukim, v'lo latei ta'amim l'halakha, and not to give reasoning to the, and maybe here halakha he means law, and maybe here halakha he means tradition, right? Like the way that the Gemara uses hilchata, and it often means that something is a masorah, like a halakha leMoshe miSinai, right? Even though about this halakha, I have an opinion that I will only say orally, and I will not write down. Now, what does that mean? He's admitting that there is a clear gap between the plain meaning of the verse, which seems to mean if you do something to someone else, your punishment is that that same wound is inflicted on you. And the halakha, which he may mean here law, or he may mean here halakha leMoshe miSinai, like the misorah of what we do halachically, of no, you only pay money. There's clearly a gap between them. And In Mor Nevuchim, he says, I'm trying to explain the pshat, and I'm not trying to explain the drash and the way we act halakha. And this last sentence is really sort of like an invitation where he says, oh, and by the way, about this tradition, I do have what to say, but I'm not going to put it in writing. Right? So there is something, if you look at Rav Bazak's book, he does treat this a little bit and suggests that Rav Avram ben Arambam, the Rambam's son, talks about this a little bit. So it's interesting, not for now, also not something that I know what he really means, right? It's speculation. But suffice it to say, this is our second approach. Our first approach was, no, this really is the pshat. Whether Chazal get it from, Kabbalah, they learned it from earlier, but it really is the pshat because it's not possible for ayin tachat ayin to be really meted out in a way that is fair, that is just. Second approach is, no, there's a clear gap between the pshat and the drash, but know that the drash is halakha leMoshe miSinai, okay? And that's where it gets its authority, right? Its authority is from God. Now we get to the third approach. And the third approach, I would say, is the most Pandora's box approach. And the reason why it's a Pandora's box is because it tries to deal with the possibility that there could be a gap between the meaning of the pasuk in its literal context and the way that we understand it, la halakha, but that is not, the gap is not made up by its halakha Moshe miSinai, God had to tell it to us. The gap is actually made up by the authority of Chazal to interpret pesukim, right? The authority of Chazal to interpret pesukim. Now, why is this a Pandora's box? Because the question of who is authorized to interpret pesukim against their grain, against their literal meaning, this is a major question in Jewish life, right? And certainly, Orthodox halakha is very clear that we do not have the authority to change the meaning of pesukim anymore. So are we saying that Chazal did? Are we saying somebody in the future will? Are we saying that nobody can? Are there certain kinds of interpretation that can change? So I just want to show you two interesting texts that relate to this. One that feels very open, and the other that's trying to give you parameters around it, okay? So the first is Rav Moshe Shmuel Glasner, the Dor Revi'i, very interesting person. We're talking late 19th century, early 20th century. And he says, and you have to remember that when people write these things, they have certain guardrails in mind, even if they don't say them. So assume that he has certain guardrails up, but we don't know precisely what they are, okay? So he says the following. The fact that originally the explanation of the Torah was transmitted orally, and actually it was usher to write it down, right? We said Dvarim Sheba'al Peh efshar lekatvan. I don't want to say it wrong. Dvarim Sheba'al Peh. I'll have to look up the exact nisuach later. But there was an actual isser. You can look, I think it's Gittin Daf Samech. You can look that Dvarim Sheba'al Peh are not supposed to be written down. So why are they not supposed to be written down? It's so that it won't be the definitive answer for all generations. So as not to tie the hands of the sages of each generation who want to interpret the pesukim based on their understanding. Because only in this way, meaning by allowing the sages of every generation to be able to interpret Torah, Torah, is Torah actually eternal? Kishinui hadorot v'deotehem matzavam u'ma'badam hagashmi v'musari, because the changes in the generations and their opinions, their situation and their material standing and their moral standing, dorshot shinui dinehem takanot v'tikunim, requires changes in law, decrees, and repairs. Wow, right? It's essentially saying as things change, whether it's material conditions or moral understandings, we need to be able to have Torah relate to our understanding, to the sages of each generation, right? And we may need to have changes in dinim, in laws, takanot, decrees, and even tikunim. We need letakein, we need to fix things. Shehi chokhmah nifla'a michokhmat Torah. That is the brilliance of Torah. Shemasra lechokhmei kol dor perush haTorah. That each generation of sages is given the possibility of interpreting the Torah, kidei shtiyeh Torah chaya, so that the Torah will live im ha'umah, with the nation, umitpatachat ima, and will be developed along with it. V'hihi nitzchiyuta, and that is the eternity of Torah. Wow, you could see how, on the one hand, things like, Takanat Rabbeinu Gershom, Ashkenazic man not allowed to marry more than one woman. You could see how that is clearly something that was a change that was required based on the moral understanding and probably also some of the material conditions of Jews at the time, right? In the Torah, a man is allowed to marry more than one woman, but Rabbeinu Gershom says, no, you can't, right? Now, what other kinds of changes would Rav Moshe Shmuel Glasner be willing to brook? To what extent? Like, could rabbis today say ayin tachat ayin only means money if we had been doing an eye for an eye literally for the past 2,000 years? He doesn't say, question mark, right? But Rav Kook, in having a conversation that is connected to this question of what is the authority to interpret Torah and to understand Torah, he's very clear, given that Rav Kook's understanding of Zionism is messianic, his understanding of a return to Eretz Yisrael is not just a resettlement of the Jews in their land, but actually ushering in a messianic redemption. He sees that as part of that messianic redemption, there will be a reestablishment of the Beit Din Hagadol, a reestablishment of the Jewish Supreme Court. And that Jewish Supreme Court will actually be able to do things like this. Let's take a look. Okay, Rav Kook. Umash anochi omer. This is what I'm saying. And this is, he doesn't start in on the messianism yet. He just starts in on the idea that Torah itself is multi-layered. It's multivalent in its meaning. Umash anochi omer, that which I say, shahayidiyah elyonah hasokeret kol ha'ma'asim merosh v'ad sof, that the supreme knowledge, right, meaning like divine understanding, which can see all things from beginning to end, he sovevet et kol haTorah kula, that is surrounding the entire Torah. He amitat kabbalat omachut shamayim, right, and this is part of the truth of accepting the yoke of heaven. She'uchneu merosh kol hasibot shesavu havanot v'hargashot lavo lidei hachlatot b'chol dor v'dor karoi v'chanachon. He says, understanding that that supreme knowledge, right, has the ability to see all interpretations, understandings, feelings that will lead to certain decisions in every generation. Meaning the Torah itself contains a supreme knowledge that isn't just here's one interpretation, but it can contain within it all of the understandings that are to come. Al kain, therefore, efshar la'amitata shel Torah lehitgalot, because the Torah contains within it all future understandings, and it contains within it all of the ideas and the meanings and the feelings, right? The truth of Torah cannot be revealed. Ki im bihiyot am Hashem kulo ba'artzo. Only once all of God's nation is in its land. Living in a state of full repair spiritually and materially. And what's going to happen then? That's when the Torah Sheval Peh is going to return to its full strength. Lafi hakarat beidin hagadol hayashiv malkom asher yivchar Hashem al kol davar asher yipalel mishpat. based on the recognition of the great Beit Din that will sit in the Beit HaMikdash and be able to judge all things that are confounding. Va'az anu b'tuchim, and at that time, we will be sure shekol toda chadasha, every new result, tieh muchteret b'chol oz b'chol kodesh, ki kodesh tirel Hashem. Every decision that Beit Din Hagadol makes will be crowned in great holiness and will be crowned in great strength because the Jewish people are holy to God. Ve'im tipol she'ela al eze mishpat Shabbat Torah. And if there falls out any question on a law in the Torah, shelafi musagei hamusar, that based on the moral concepts of the time, it will seem that it needs to be understood in a different way. Notice they're not saying abrogate the law, they're saying reinterpret it. As im be'emet al pi beit din hagadol yuchlat, then if it truly based on that great court sitting in the Beit HaMikdash in Messianic times, it will be decided shezeh hamishpat, that this law of the Torah lo ne'emar was not said ki'im be'otam hatnaim shekvar inam, except for those conditions that no longer exist. Vadai yimatzeh al zeh makor b'Torah. There must be a way to source that in the Torah. In other words, what Rav Kook does is he says, you know that I would say that same samchut, that same authority that Chazal had to be able to interpret the Torah against its grain, he is arguing that in Messianic times, with a Beit Din Hagadol, that Beit Din will be able to do the same. And notice he says, Lafi musagei hamusar, if the concepts of morality suggest that there needs to be a reinterpretation. Now, of course, there's so much more to say about this, but suffice it to say, what we've done here is we've offered 3 different models for how to understand the authority and the possibility of Peshat and Derash being so far apart as in ayin tachat ayin. One is the Derash, even though it seems like it's not the contextual literal meaning, actually shows you the deeper contextual literal meaning of the pasuk, that if you tried to apply it, you could only apply it the way that Chazal interpret it. A second, the only way we can authorize a pa'ar, a gap between Peshat and Derash like this, is if the Derash is halakha Moshe miSinai. So even though it contradicts the Peshat, it is also from Hashem. And a third, this conversation of what was the authority of Chazal. Is it possible that the authority of Chazal was actually to interpret pesukim against their grain differently than the literal meaning of the pasuk? And Rav Kook, in a very sort of provocative way, asking the question or making the assertion that in Messianic times, once you have a Beit Din Hagadol, they will also have that samchut. They will also have that authority. So I hope this has been good food for thought for you, and enjoy the rest of your learning this week.